Hello everyone. To start off week 2, I'm going to introduce spatial data models. So I'm going to talk about the raster data model and the vector data model. I'm going to explain a little bit about what they are, how they work, how they're different, and then mention some key considerations you need to make or think about when working with them. So I'm going to talk about different types of phenomena, scale, and the different uses for raster and vector data. So to jump right into it, data models are what we use to represent spatial data in a GIS. A data model is just an abstract system that helps us organize information about something, so a physical object or phenomena, in a consistent manner. And so you take the real world, you project it into a GIS, the next step is to represent your data. And how you want to represent that might depend on what kind of data information you're given or what task you might have at hand or the scale at which you're working on it. Oftentimes, the choice of which data model that you want to use comes down to depending on 3 factors: which type of phenomena that we're going to try to represent, the scale at which we plan to analyze the data, and how we plan to use the data. So first I'm going to introduce just what raster and vector means, and then I will talk about these key considerations. Raster data is the simplest type of data model. It represents space using a grid of equally sized pixels or cells to represent everything within a certain domain. So essentially you can envision a sheet of graph paper where every single cell might have one number in it, and that number corresponds to some value. So that single value is going to be assigned to each cell and can be used to represent something. The value can be a code that can represent a category. So in this instance, for instance, 1, 2, 3, 4 could represent different types of land cover. Or it could be a numeric value that represents something specific like elevation or precipitation or temperature. And so the raster data model is simply organized into rows or columns and rows and all the cells within them. And so in GIS, rasters are most commonly encountered as satellite imagery, which you're going to work with in Lab 2, drone imagery, which I talked a little bit about last week, elevation models, we'll do a bit with that in Lab 4, or Lab 3, I think. Bathymetric models is essentially the same thing as elevation, but underwater, or scanned maps. So you got an introduction into that in Lab 1. And so again, the raster data model just uses numeric data assigned to each value, and that numeric data can correspond to something, so land cover like agriculture, forest, or water. And then it's best used to represent surfaces, so things where there's a continuous variation over space. So something like land cover, where every bit of land is covered by something, are usually best for raster data because you can map out the full coverage over the area you're looking at. And one of the biggest advantages of raster data is the ease with which you can do something called raster overlay. So you can take multiple layers and stack them on top of each other, with each layer representing something different. And this lends itself to doing algebraic expressions very easily. So multiple layers can be combined and stacked on top of each other, and you can do math expressions to come up with new answers. So for instance, if A is the average July temperature and B is the average January temperature, if you subtract B from A, you can get the average annual temperature range. And you're just doing that same math equation for every point where those cells overlap. So if the average July temperature in a single cell in A is 8.3, like in the one on the left, and then the average January temperature is 4.5, then you can do the math and you get 3.8. And so this is a pretty computationally efficient, easy way to do math with spatial data layers. And we'll talk more about raster overlay methods later on in the semester. The other type of data is the vector data model. So the vector data model is a bit more flexible, but also a bit more complicated. So vector data uses points, lines, or polygons to represent objects. Something like a fire hydrant or a street light might be well represented by a point. Roads or sewer lines might be well represented by a line. City blocks, buildings, things like that are better represented by polygons. And then it stores the shapes and the data separately. So with the raster data model, it just stores one value, continuous over space, and that is the data layer. With the vector data model, it stores a bunch of different shapes in one file, and then it has certain identifier keys that link them to attributes, and the attributes are stored differently, or in a different table elsewhere. So this complicates the data structure, but it allows you to save a lot more attributes or information about every single entity, point, line, or polygon. So you can have many, many different attributes associated with one object. So the three different types, again, there's point data. So points are zero-dimensional. That is, they don't have a length or a width or a height. All they are is a single pair of coordinates, x and y, describing a location. So they have no shape, no area, no length, no width. They are just a place on a map, and no matter how much you zoom in on points, it's just going to be a point. So you worked with point data in lab 1. The depth layer was a set of points. So each xy coordinate just represented the location of an address somewhere within those houses. Line data is one step up from point data. Lines are one-dimensional. They have a width, they have a length, but no width or height. And so lines have at least 2 points, a beginning and an end point, and then any point in between along that path is called a vertex. So lines can be essentially a connection of an infinite number of points. And so, again, they have a length, but no width or height. So something that works well for road layer or sewer lines or like electrical transmission lines, flight paths, anything that is a linear object that you don't need to calculate the area of. You just need to know a path, for instance. And then there's polygon data. So polygons are two-dimensional. They can have both a length and a width. And so it takes at least 3 points to make a polygon. You might remember from high school geometry, the simplest possible shape is a triangle. It requires 3 points to make it. So you need at least 3 points, right? So lines have at least 2, beginning and an end. Points have only 1, and polygons have 3. And so the beginning and the end point of a polygon must be the same. If the beginning and the end point are not the same, it's not a closed shape, and it's just a line. And so polygons can have straight or curved line segments, and typically these are called edges. So you can see in the coordinates on the bottom how the beginning point and the end points are the same for the polygons, whereas they are not for the lines. And for the points, there's just one. So vector data stores the attributes separate from the spatial data. And this is called tabular data. So basically, tabular just means table. What happens is all of the attributes associated with all of the shapes within a vector layer are stored in a table that is separate from the spatial information. And so this information is linked by an ID, a unique identifier. So in the simple example that I have on the screen, we can see 3 different vector layers on a map. We've got blue dots, and we'll say they represent streetlights. We've got red lines, and those represent streets. And then we've got gray rectangles, and those represent buildings. So I'm showing an example for the attribute table of the buildings layer. The spatial information, which is all of the coordinates for the polygons, so that would be the coordinates on this table, is has associated with it an identifier for each individual shape. So one building might have ID number 1, another one has ID number 2. So I'm showing the link for ID number 2, for instance. And then separately, there's a table. And that table also has a unique ID number, and that links it to the shape. And then it has a bunch of columns with different attributes in it. So in this case, we have 3 attributes. We have the building name, the year it was built, and the building height. But there's essentially an unlimited number of attributes that you can store. So we can have very complex data. We can have very complex collections of data stored along with vector data. So this is really advantageous when working with something like the census, for instance, where you have lots of different pieces of information you want to keep track of: population, income, rental costs, variety of factors. And so you'll work with census data a bit in Lab 2, and you'll get a little bit of an introduction into how to work with tabular data, how to link tabular data to spatial data using what's called a join. And yeah. Some important rules for working with tabular data, just to keep in mind. Only one data type is allowed per column, and I will discuss in more depth what I mean by data type, but for now, think like text versus numbers. So geography would be a text data type, whereas 1925 would be a date, and building height would be a number. And so you can't mix and match data types between different columns. You want to keep it consistent. So a column of text needs to be all text. And if you put numbers into a text column, then it's just going to assume that those numbers are just part of text, and it's not going to be able to do mathematical calculations. Whereas if you're working with numeric data, it needs to all be in numeric format in order to do anything with it. Otherwise, it will throw an error. And then there's certain different special data types like dates, which can be stored and represented differently, and you can associate like time zone information with it and stuff. But that might be a bit beyond the scope of what's worth talking about in an intro lecture on this. There's also only one entry per cell, so you have one row that is associated with one object, and for each column, the row can only have one entity. Again, the rows are distinct, so we can't have like a repeated row. We can't have 2 ID number 2s because they would link to the same shape within the spatial data, and that also wouldn't work. And lastly, you can have null values. So we can have missing data. Some records, some rows can have values for certain attributes, and other rows might not have any values for those attributes, and that's perfectly fine. And you'll see as you get into working with tables in ARC how it can be beneficial to have missing data values in some areas.